President Trump launched an economic missile aimed directly at Canada's industrial heartland, hiking tariffs on steel and autos in a declared effort to protect American jobs. But the missile went haywire. Instead of a targeted strike, it triggered a chain reaction of economic chaos that is now crippling the U.S. auto industry itself. With production plummeting and profits evaporating, the policy has backfired spectacularly, leaving American workers paying the price. How did a plan to save an American industry end up putting it on life support? For more than half a century, the U.S. and Canadian auto industries weren't just partners, they were one entity. The 1965 Auto Pact erased the border for cars and parts, creating a single continental manufacturing powerhouse. This deeply integrated system was the envy of the world, a model of industrial efficiency and shared prosperity. A car might cross the border half a dozen times as a collection of parts before rolling off the line as a finished product, a testament to a partnership built on trust and mutual benefit. But this foundation of cooperation began to rust under the ideology of America First. The Trump administration reframed this integrated system not as a shared success story, but as a tale of American loss. The narrative took hold that Canada had been siphoning off American jobs and that the seamless supply chain was a vulnerability, not a strength. The intricate dance of cross-border manufacturing was recast as a zero-sum game. This new adversarial view saw Canadian steel and Canadian assembled cars not as components of a shared industry, but as foreign threats to be neutralized. The stage was set to take a sledgehammer to the world's most successful industrial partnership, all in the name of protecting America from its closest friend. In early 2025, the Trump administration launched its economic blitzkrieg. The first missile was a 25% tariff on all imported automobiles, a move that sent shockwaves through the highly integrated North American industry. The stated goal was to protect U.S. manufacturing and force automakers to move production back to American soil. It was a core tenet of the America First agenda, to make America the fortress of its own industrial base. But this was just the opening salvo. On June 3rd, 2025, the White House unleashed a weapon of economic mass destruction. It hiked the existing tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum from an already punishing 25% to a catastrophic 50%. This was a move designed not just to protect U.S. steelmakers, but to cripple their Canadian competitors, effectively shutting them out of the American market. The strategy from the White House was simple and brutal. By making Canadian steel prohibitively expensive, they believed they could force U.S. automakers to buy American, thus boosting the U.S. steel industry. The auto tariff was the second part of the pincer movement, punishing any car company that continued to assemble vehicles in Canada for the U.S. market. President Trump sold this strategy to the public as a tough but necessary plan to stand up for the American worker against unfair foreign competition. It was a declaration that the era of friendly, integrated supply chains was over. This was economic nationalism in its purest, most aggressive form, an attempt to use brute tariff force to fundamentally rewire the continent's industrial landscape in America's favor. The administration was confident that this 1-2 punch would bring Canada to its knees and revitalize American manufacturing. In Canada, the impact was immediate and devastating. The 50% steel tariff was a death blow. Canadian steel producers who had built their businesses for decades around serving the U.S. market were, in the words of one industry report, nearly shut out. The consequences were swift and brutal. Mass layoffs began to ripple through steel towns, and planned investments were frozen overnight. The auto sector was reeling from its own crisis. The 25% tariff caused Canadian auto exports to the United States to plummet by a staggering 23% in the single month of April 2025. The industrial heartland of Ontario, home to a dense network of assembly plants and parts suppliers, was suddenly facing an existential threat. The crisis forced Prime Minister Mark Carney into a series of emergency meetings with auto executives, scrambling to find a way to save an industry that was being held hostage. But Canada was not going to be a passive victim. Faced with this economic assault, the Carney government prepared to fire back. Instead of just absorbing the blow, Ottawa announced that it was readying its own powerful countermeasures. They began preparing a retaliatory 25% tariff on American-made cars and, crucially, on auto parts imported from the United States. This was a strategically brilliant and incredibly risky move. By targeting parts, Canada was aiming its economic missile directly at the complex supply chains of the American Big Three automakers in Detroit. It was a signal that this would not be a one-sided war. Canada was demonstrating that it understood the deep integration of the industry and was willing to use that integration as a weapon of its own, ensuring that any pain inflicted on Canadian auto workers would be felt just as acutely by their American counterparts. This set the stage for a catastrophic industrial stalemate. The two nations were now locked in a high-stakes game of chicken, with the future of their most important manufacturing sector hanging in the balance. Trump's tariffs, designed to help the US, had instead pushed the entire North American auto industry to the brink of a self-inflicted collapse. Any move by one side would trigger an immediate and devastating response from the other. For the US to continue its assault meant inviting crippling retaliatory tariffs that would paralyze its own assembly lines. For Canada to fire back meant risking a further escalation that could wipe out its own industry. There was no easy off-ramp. The attempt to decouple the two economies had instead revealed just how dangerously dependent they were on each other. For the people of Hamilton, Ontario, a city nicknamed Steel Town, the 50% tariff wasn't a policy debate. It was a body blow. For over a century, this city's identity and its prosperity have been forged in the fire of its blast furnaces. The steel mills provided not just jobs, but a way of life, stable, unionized work that could support a family, buy a house, and build a community. The US tariff threatened to extinguish that life overnight. With their primary market effectively closed, Canadian steel companies were forced into immediate painful cuts. The layoffs came in waves, sending a chill through the entire city. For a third-generation steelworker suddenly without a job, the news from Washington felt like a profound betrayal. They had spent their lives making a product essential to the North American economy, only to be branded an economic enemy by their closest neighbor. The pain was just as sharp in Canada's auto sector. The 23% plunge in exports to the US in a single month created a state of emergency. Automakers and parts suppliers, already operating on thin margins, couldn't absorb the massive cost of a 25% tariff. The emergency meetings with Prime Minister Carney were a desperate search for a lifeline. But for the thousands of workers whose livelihoods depend on the hum of the assembly line, the damage was already being done. The constant threat of a trade war created a toxic environment of uncertainty, making it impossible for companies to plan for the future and leaving workers wondering every single day if their shift would be the last. But the most stunning part of this story is not what happened in Canada. It's what happened in the United States. The tariffs, designed to be a shield for American industry, had backfired and become a sword turned inward. The plan to force US automakers to buy American steel had a fatal flaw. They were already buying Canadian steel because they needed it. The sudden 50% price hike created a massive cost shock that they couldn't absorb. This was the first blow. The 25% auto tariff was the second. As the costs of both raw materials and imported components spiraled, American automakers were caught in a vice. The result was a production crisis. Across North America, output was projected to fall by nearly 8% in the second quarter of 2025 alone, meaning 126,000 cars and trucks that were scheduled to be built simply weren't. Companies like Stellantis were forced to announce temporary layoffs at their US plants. The financial damage was staggering. Honda, which builds a massive number of cars in the United States, saw its operating profit collapse by 50% in the first quarter of 2025. The company stated that the primary reason was the US tariff environment, which cost them an estimated 125 billion yen. This is the ultimate irony. A policy enacted to protect American manufacturing was now strangling it. It was driving up costs, slashing production, cutting profits, and threatening the jobs of the very American workers it was supposed to help. The attempt to punish Canada had ended up kneecapping the US auto industry, damaging its competitiveness, and proving that in a deeply integrated economy, you can't wage war on your neighbor without bombing your own factories. A president's attempt to protect an American industry has backfired into a full-blown crisis, crippling the very companies it was meant to help, and pushing the entire North American auto sector to the brink. The brute force of tariffs has collided with the complex reality of a deeply integrated economy, leaving workers and businesses on both sides of the border paying the price. The old partnership is broken, leaving two nations to navigate the wreckage. In the race to define the future, will North America win together, or will both nations lose by trying to go it alone? Are you American or Canadian? Share your story and your perspective in the comments below.